not without you. Okay, let me start with Maria Clara Araújo dos Passos herself, on the very right. Thank you for coming over from Sao Paulo and being ready to share your wisdom also in German and in English. I'm looking forward to the conversation with you. You are quite a well-known figure in Brazil now. After publishing your book in 2022, there was quite a media interest in you as somebody with a strong academic focus on travesti education from an Afro-trans feminist perspective. And we will talk about this in detail in a second. Next to you, Camila Nobrega Alves, who is a journalist, who is also a researcher on gender and on ecological justice, and she is somebody who's going back and forth between South America and Germany, Brazil and and Germany. So that will inform the conversation. Next to her, Paz Guevara, curator of exhibitions in Haus der Kulturen der Welt, but also a teacher at Weißensee Art University and working on radical pedagogies. And the next guests come as a duo, as a team. Judy Allen-Richter and Sophie Maurer from Freie Universität in Berlin. They are enrolled in, if I'm not mistaken, Children's Psychology Department. And you two have been conducting research on gender euphoria in trans and non-binary youth. So these are the perspectives for the conversation. And as a starter, because I've been talking too much, I would like to invite Maria Clara to start off the conversation with an opening statement.
Hello. Thank you so much, Daniel. So, quote, "We travestis should have the right to read what other travestis write," unquote. All versions of my book start with this message, once said by Claudia Rodrigues, a Latin American travesti author and activist. After decades of being othered by the cisgender gaze, it is finally time to be able to transition from being an object to a subject who can talk back. Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. My name is Maria Clara Araújo dos Passos, and I am an Afro-Brazilian travesti scholar and the author of Pedagogies of Travesti Liberation. I'm Pedagogue de Travesti Beviga. I tried. First, I would like to thank the entire team at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt for collaborating on this project with me, Daniel, Marine, Otieno, and Paz. Thank you so much for engaging in a truly dialogical, as Paulo Freire would name it, collaboration. I would also like to thank Jurema Mombasa and Lucy Delir, who accepted our invitation to be part of this project. And obviously, Natalia Afonso and Charlotte for their hard work as the translators of my book. I would also like to thank all the speakers for accepting our invitation and for being part of this moment of joy and celebration. And obviously, I want to thank you, the audience. I'm seeing so many familiar faces here, people who have been by my side since the very beginning of this journey, and I thank you for being here. Muito obrigado, de verdade. And last but not least, I want to thank the Orishas that I'm devoted to. Today is Saturday, and today is the day that we are supposed to pray for Shun and for Yansan, the Orishas that I was initiated for. So, Iraye Oshun, Yepahe Yansan. We just watched Pedagogias da Navalha, Pedagogies of the Razor, a documentary written and produced by Afro-Brazilian travesti filmmakers. My book was one of the references for this film, and I thought that showing it at the launch of the English and German editions would provide like a visual representation of what I discuss in Pedagogies of Travesty Liberation. As we travestis stand at the crossroads, we can produce a specific kind of oppositional and insurgent knowledge. Throughout the book, I argue that pedagogies is an invitation. It's an invitation to meet, to embrace, and to foster complexity. By this, I mean that Brazilian travestis and their emancipatory knowledge invite us to think differently. They invite us to see the world through a different lens. After being excluded by Brazilian society for decades, we came to realize the potential of being an outsider within, a concept coined by Professor Patricia Hill Collins. Pedagogies of Travesty Liberation can be viewed as an archive. This book was the first to be published in Brazil, documenting the socio-political journey of Brazilian travestis and transsexual women, as well as their efforts to reclaim a critical, reflexive citizenship. I wrote this book in response to the following question: what could the field of education learn from the critical decolonial pedagogies produced by the travesti movement in Brazil? I argue that many of us Brazilian travestis did not recognize ourselves as citizens within schools. Instead, we became politically aware of our power to intervene in Brazilian society through the political pedagogical praxis carried out by Brazilian travestis. The travesti and transsexual women's movement in Brazil created its own pedagogies. I wrote this book to challenge what Viviane Vergueiro coined as ciscoloniality of knowledge. I was committed to challenging the idea that Brazilian travestis, especially those who are Black, cannot engage in complex thinking. The book deconstructs the descriptions written by white, cisgender anthropologists and demonstrates how travestis in Brazil have developed their own knowledge despite material and epistemic violence. As mentioned in the introduction, several ongoing conversations about decolonization are taking place in the United States and across Europe. However, the knowledge produced in the Global South is often overlooked or intentionally erased. Furthermore, decolonial has become an empty, non-performative word that does not do what people claim it does. By translating Pedagogias das Travestilidades into English and German, Hakavi challenges this coloniality of knowledge. By introducing an English and German speaking audience to the praxis carried out by Brazilian travestis, we invite you to shift with us what Professor Linda Alcoff called the geography of reason. In dialogue with Pedagogies of the Razor, I would also like to emphasize how affirming the untranslatability of the political pedagogical practices carried out by Brazilian travestis is an anti-colonial gesture. As travesti scholars, activists, and filmmakers, we believe that some terms should not be translated. More than a term that we use to identify ourselves, we have also been reclaiming travesti as a lens. Travesti means something beyond the colonial gender binary. And because of that, for the last 10 years, we have been remembering the experience of Chica Manicongo, someone who was kidnapped from Africa and then reported to the Inquisition in Salvador, Bahia, because she refused to wear men's ensembles. Critically revisiting the archive has shown how the hate against Afro-Brazilian travestis has colonial roots. So in pedagogies, rather than trying to translate or define what it means to be a travesti, I understand travesti as a political and pedagogical site of insurgency. I'm more concerned with the praxis carried out by Brazilian travestis over the last 30 years than providing stable and coherent definitions. As discussed in the book, many people are saying the word crisis right now. I do agree that it's tangible to say that this current global temporality has its complex nuances. Still, as scholars, I do think it is our duty to provoke a deeper conversation about what it means to live in times of crisis, or to debate whether this context of crisis is ephemeral or something that has been going on in the lives of trans people for quite some time. When revisiting the historical journey of the Brazilian trans community, different moments could be understood as times of crisis. For example, by way of example, the Brazilian civil military dictatorship was very intentional in persecuting, in arresting, and killing travestis. And even after the re-democratization of Brazil, police brutality continued. The HIV epidemic by itself was a moment of crisis for our community. But at the same time, opposing police brutality and fighting for access to health were the main agendas of an emerging national travesti movement in Brazil. So I think it is essential to highlight the oppositional practices that emerged from those turning points moments in history. This global context of anti-trans attacks should not paralyze us. Anti-trans attacks in the United States, in Germany, in Brazil should not hidden our ability to see beyond. We must continue nurturing the travesti possibility discussed by J. Jurema Mombasa in the preface of the book. We must continue to imagine what was once considered impossible. This is precisely what the liberatory pedagogies of Brazilian travestis have taught me. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This is surely a lot to unpack, and I invite all the other panelists to relate to what Maria Clara has just said. And maybe you would like to start, Camila? Okay. Yes, I can use this moment also to point out that the pedagogy of the razor blade was also the inspiration for the visuality of this book, which you might realize. So it all makes sense.
Hello, Gucci. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to share the panel with all of you, and it's really an honor to be here to the launch of your book in English and German and to celebrate. I think I have so many notes, but this is I'm just showing that to you because this was the result of your book. When I reread, I read in Portuguese, and when I reread in the last days, so it affected me so much in a kind of a dialogue that I entered with you that I started like writing, and I'm pretty analogical when I really get deep in touch with some books. So it's also a challenge to now engage in some parts with some parts of the book because there is so much that you are bringing in theoretical elaborations and in methods. I think you are discussing a lot how to do what you call excavations.
Yes.
No? So I have part of my notes are dialogues that I did with your book, so I'll quote some parts so we can open, like share a bit more with the audience. You say the English and German version of this book, this is the introduction that you added, are launched in the midst of global attacks to the right of gender identity. Words such as anti-gender are reinforced in our vocabulary. I think it's very important to share why I'm bringing this and why your book has a so important role, not just in Brazil, but in Germany at this very specific moment. And so I speak from sharing a bit my own positionality. So I'm Brazilian. I live between Brazil and Germany for the last 10 years. I consider myself a woman and not as well. And we talked a bit about it when we had the first conversation, meaning the way that we have been discussing womanhood in Latin America and the way we have been understanding the concept of woman is also very diverse. You know? And so understanding, when I say that I'm also a woman, but also not, it means I don't belong to any kind of binarism of women. No? If there is an understanding, there is binary, and that's cisgendered binary, then I'm not part. But in Brazil and in Latin America, the configuration of not necessarily what we call queer here in Berlin, but of a multiplicity of LGBTQ plus movements open the boxes of how to understand it. You know? And the references that we have that build the non-binary and non-cisgendered system, they also belong to some movements that call themselves, that claim the concept of womanhood and trans womanhood, for example. So trans movements and trans scholars, indigenous scholars, Afro-diasporic and Afro communities in Brazil and in Latin America they do conform other formats of understanding womanhood. So that's why I'm trying to share my own reflections of positionality to understand myself as a non-binary person, but also woman. And it has been very, very hard in German academia to dialogue with this kind of understanding beyond what's understood as queer. Because here, the term queer is coined, is understood as Berlin is considered a very queer city. Berlin is considered from an outside perspective and from an inside European, also colonial perspective, very pioneer. So I think your book is a great razor to this kind of understanding of queer. And it brings us to two questions, two very specific things you name. One is time. So when we talk about backlashes on the one hand, but also when we talk about the establishment of cisgendered racial systems. When we talk about it, we need to expand. You do something in your book that is brilliant, and I think it's very important, the concept of time, right? When you say, I want to expand the temporality that we are going to talk about. And you say, I don't want to look to what's happening and the answers, for example, from trans movements in Brazil for the situations and the anti-gender actions. But you offer in your book a much bigger temporality, and that's how I go back to the word excavation that you bring. Because then I think in some, you bring, Maria Clara brings in her book the idea of excavation, which in Europe is usually still, even for queer studies, used a lot back, like, okay, then you are doing a Foucauldian approach. No, you are not. No? Or you are in dialogue, but you are offering something that is absolutely powerful, which is the need and the need of community and collective excavation. So in your book you say that the transition is collective, a transição é coletiva. And then I would ask you, isn't the excavation also collective? In the German academic system, this is one of the most difficult things to argue. The collective forms of excavation and the collective forms of social movement, scholarship. I mean, maybe many of you are also in academia in Germany and you understand what I'm saying. So you really bring a different kind of excavation. Let me go back to my notes just to wrap up some things I think are very important to bring. So that I wanted to go back to the concept of time and the backlash that you say, the anti-gender moment in Germany and in the whole world. And there is one thing that claims a lot my attention, which is when, for example, Bolsonaro was in power in Brazil, when we had the right wing in power in Brazil, and I was invited sometimes to talk about what was happening. Germany was seeing Brazil from all the problems and vulnerabilities and everything that we were living there, and especially the ones that were there all the time, and keeping the fight, the scholarship, the criticism up, and you were pretty much directly as a political assessora,
Yes,
advisor. But then it was considered I would hear from here, I would hear from a perspective from here, people then asking what's happening in Brazil. The right wing and the backlash is happening in Brazil. But now that it's happening also in Europe, it's global. It's global. And it's the same that happens, there are some connections that we see with when we talk about environmental crisis. When it gets global, it's global. And global, there is no nuances in global, There are no differences, and there are differences. Because in Brazil, for example, in this moment, and in Brazil, the fight that was fought by trans people, by by Afro-diasporic communities, by black scholars, black activists, social movements, land rights movements. The fight continued, and the scholarship in discussion and discussing the whole backlash continued, and the situation there is not the same at the moment. So when we say just global, we take out all the nuances and we take out all the movements that go back, as you say, to a much bigger temporality. So it's this moment of, and I call a very brilliant scholar also working at the FU Berlin Jihad, Yagoubi, she's from Morocco, Chide from Morocco, and living in Berlin for more than 10 years, I think. And in a conference we had 2 weeks ago, Jihad expressed in a very good, like wrap up in a very good sense, the backlash are backlashes. And this sense of Europe and like the minority of the world, usually so-called global north, I don't like the concept, to say, now we are living a huge backlash. It's unprecedented, you know. This is also a privilege of not seeing all the other backlashes happening in different temporalities, and you bring it directly in your book. No? You bring from travesty and transwoman movement perspective. So, yeah, I mean, I think I will stop from just because we want to engage with discussions, but I wanted to just leave as a question also for you, like how do you feel this situation, putting your lens in Europe, inverting the lenses as you do also in your work, in your methodology, in your theoretical elaboration that you offer. Thank you so much for your book.
Maybe it's a good moment to bring Paz into the conversation, because Camila, you were bringing in the idea of the global fascisms way of speaking, and you might know that we have an exhibition in HKW at the moment, the global fascisms, and Paz Guevara has been curating it. So would you like to take this train of thought and maybe connect it to the ideas of radical pedagogies countering these movements towards global fascism?
I can respond to both comments, yes.
Thank you. For me, it's also very enormous joy to be with Maria Clara here, with Daniel, with all the panelists, especially that with Maria Clara we're debating today, opening up many of the philosophies, pedagogies of your book, but also we have been having many pedagogical moments, pedagogical practices. So I want to also to praise your generosity and your consistent practice. So 1.5 years ago, we were meeting in the exhibition Exercises of Transformation of artist Sergio Ceballos with the students of spatial strategies. And there was very important to reflect with you on the pedagogies of the bodies that is very strong in your book. And only little time before we start this public conversation, we have a second pedagogical moment with the current generation of spatial strategies. And for us was very important the reflection on the different spaces. So in fact, not a neutral, homogenizing global space, but how very precise space can change through the pedagogies of the body, pedagogies of emancipation. So the very house, HKW could be one of these spaces, but for you, was very important how a university, how pedagogical spaces can learn through the travesty emancipation, through the movement. And something that was very strong for us, we were reading yesterday, Friday morning, again, part of your text. So how you say that it was not schools, in fact, the spaces in which you recognize yourself as a citizen, but the social movement, the travesti movement, the street, the meetings. So we were reflecting on these different spaces of transformation. So the reflections that we were doing today were not so much toward global fascism, but more through how the connection of bodies and spaces that you trace very strongly lead to transformation. So very much we started yesterday reflecting from Paulo Freire, pedagogies of the oppressed, how through self-reflection, the awareness of the forces, of the conditions that imply certain limits and the violence of education that you mentioned, we can somehow construct transformations, these possibilities that Jota Mombasa is tracing in the introduction to live the life we want. So this, I think, is important to share on these roots of the social movement, the travesti movement, and this agency of transformation.
Okay, so many things to comment. First, I think I know that we have some Brazilian people here. Yes, but I do feel that it's important to give some context to those who are not so familiar with the material conditions of the travesti and trans community in Brazil. So I am part of a younger generation who is accessing spaces that once were considered impossible for us, right? Even being here and speaking in English, it is seen um, by many travestis as something that express some kind of privilege, because we are talking about a community that don't have access to job opportunities unless it is sex work. We are talking about a community that unfortunately is excluded from educational institutions. So I'm part of a younger generation uh, that is accessing spaces and opportunities due to the work that has been developed by our elders. So I think that is why when I was finishing my bachelor's in pedagogy, that is why I decided to talk about the travesti movement in Brazil. And just so you know, the book was published in 2022, and okay, let's celebrate, but this was the first book in some way, like offering people the history of the trans movement in Brazil. This was like the first one documenting, the struggle, the travesti struggle in Brazil. So this lack of interest, by publishers and by the Brazilian academia as well, talks a lot about how we are being overlooked, not only as scholars, but also as people who have been intervening and contributing to the Brazilian democracy. So that is why I decided to write pedagogies. Like Daniel said, this is my bachelor's thesis. For bachelor's thesis, it is doing a lot. This is my bachelor's thesis, and I was very committed to pay homage to the work that allowed me to get a degree, but I was also committed and very intentional in showing to the field of education what this field could learn from those pedagogies, from those practices, from this action and reflection, this praxis that has been carried out by Brazilian travestis. So in some way, it was what I tried to do was to change the dynamic. I was not asking travestis, saying to travestis that we could learn from some standard educational pedagogical practices. I was, instead of that, looking to education and saying, what can we learn from those pedagogies produced by travestis? And I think um, a similar movement in terms of movimento mesmo, Hakabi is doing something similar because I'm not bringing the history of the German trans movement to Brazil, I'm actually I'm changing the rules of the conversation, Actually, very often we in South America, people come with books and with theories and with episodes that are happening in the so-called global north and say, hey, look, learn. And I think that the decision around translating pedagogies of travesty liberation was an invitation so we could exchange, in a more horizontal, I don't know if that word exists, but in a more dialogical way. So I was very pleased when Hakavi decided to translate not only the book into English but also into German, because talking about anti-gender movements, they are very connected. Right now, I work as the Movement Partnerships Coordinator at the Black Feminist Fund, so I'm directly supporting Black feminist movements across the world. And by doing that, I can see how anti-gender movements are very connected. The executive order signed by Donald Trump in his first days back in office, talking about gender ideology and biological truth, the same lexicon that you can find in that document, you could find in Bolsonaro's administration documents. So they are sharing grammar, they are sharing lexicon, they are sharing practices. Brazil was a lab, in terms of, okay, what this category of gender ideology, what this phantasm, as Judith Butler would say, could do in this country. And now that it is not possible, now that it cannot do things anymore because it was ruled as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, let's bring this word to other countries and let's test this word and its possibility to mobilize people in other countries. So I think, at least this is my invitation to you. I think that this book is an invitation so we can start a deeper conversation around surrounding what we can exchange, in terms of political practices, political strategies, because they are connected and they are working through networks, and I do think that we must do the same thing politically and theoretically as well.
Absolutely. And, we're here in an institution which is state funded, and our Minister of Culture has infamously banned gender inclusive language from his own resort. So it's politically a very important moment also for us to have this conversation, to connect and to enable as an institution these dialogues across different cultures. And just by looking at your way of describing the travesti struggle in Brazil, communities in Berlin or in English-speaking countries can learn, can understand, and they can connect, and this can hopefully overcome this anti-gender movement towards something that is more, enjoying life, enjoying gender diversity, coming more to the euphoric moment.
Can I add something?
Please do.
it will be brief. So, a few months back, I attended a workshop at Harvard University, and we were having a discussion on trans studies there. And someone was presenting their paper, and the paper's title was really powerful, something like "Against Gender" or "Against Gender," against the policy of choosing. Let's try to use that metaphor. And I was like, but why? Because this policy, like demanding the Brazilian state to recognize the chosen name of trans students, have indeed contributed to the access and retention of those students in schools. So this is something that is important to us. And then this person said something like, oh no, I'm talking about the US experience. And I said, oh, but there is no US in the title. I'm just saying against chosen names. And that's the dynamic sometimes, you know. The so-called global north has the right to be really big in its statements, you know. So that's why also I think we decided not to add like a subtitle saying lessons from Brazil. So, you know, we did not do that. It's pedagogies of travesty liberation. It's also pedagogies of trans liberation. But we felt that it was important to keep travesty because a title like pedagogies of trans liberation would not translate the effort, the struggle that travestis have been developing in Brazil way before the trans identity was introduced, you know? So I think it is an homage to my elders. It is an act of recognition of their political and pedagogical and epistemological contribution as well, because my theory has their work as a reference, you know, and also to say to education that in order for education to be really something that we can say that is democratic in Brazil, because there is this big slogan in Brazil, the education is a universal right, education must acknowledge those pedagogies that are being produced in terreiros, in feminist spaces, in the streets, you know. I think in the second chapter, because the book has changed, in the second chapter you will see that the very beginning of the travesty movement in Brazil started in the streets. When Giovanna Baby was like giving condoms to sex workers and saying, do you want to attend a meeting so we could discuss about our rights? This was the beginning of the travesty movement in Brazil, you know? It was this kind of street, a practice of awareness in streets that allowed me to be here today addressing you, you know?
Thanks a lot. I realize we're already short in time, so I'd really like to bring Julie Ellen and Sophie into the conversation. I'm happy we are starting tonight with an academic discourse and dialogue, and you two have been working on gender euphoria in trans and non-binary youth. I think the category of travesty has not been part of the research, but please tell us what you research and how this relates to Maria Clara's work.
Yeah, first, also we want to express how grateful we are sitting at this panel and how honored it is to be talking about your work, Maria Clara, and to be talking with all of you. So when I read your book, I thought, what a rich account of the historical movement and also of the movement of the travestis today, and how much to learn from it. And also, so we want to talk a little bit about our project, but also how it connects to what you write about in the book. So maybe introducing our project quickly, we are doing a research project on gender euphoria and trans and non-binary youth in online forums. So maybe to give you a little bit of orientation, what's noteworthy of this study in the academic context is first the topic of it, because gender euphoria is not really a typical topic to be talked about in academia, especially in psychology, where we are coming from. The discourse is very much focused on pathologization, on gender dysphoria, on the health burden, and so on. So, of course, these are real experiences that are also important to be researched on, but it risks of one-dimensionally putting trans people into a category of vulnerable persons, of victims, and so on. So it's so important to introduce gender euphoria as a concept in research as well, and it's also important because it is a concept coming from the community itself.
Yes. Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I can only second what Sophie said. It's an honor to be here. I wanted to highlight two other noteworthy things about our project. As Sophie already said, we researched in online communities. We took data from internet forums for trans youth, and we analyzed these data. And yeah, as you already said in your book, online spaces can foster exchanging knowledge through discussion. And yeah, we wanted to center community knowledge, especially because we're researching a concept by trans people. And yes, secondly, we did qualitative analysis, and psychology is predominantly quantitative research and thinks of itself as like natural science and very objective. And in qualitative research, that's usually not the case, and we see that researchers are positioned in specific ways. And you also quote Arroyo saying there's no universal perspective, and saying especially community knowledge is also like not universal and it's specific. And yes, we did that, and we yeah, talked about our positionalities together. And Sophie can say more about who took part in the research.
Yeah, maybe a quick addition to, because we were talking about the importance of geographies, of where knowledge is coming from and where research is being conducted. So we don't really know for sure where our research is conducted, because we are just talking about these online forums, but we are assuming it's mostly taking place in the so-called global north, so North America and Europe, from what we are reading out of the posts. So that's important to know about the context, I guess. And then to the context of our research project, it took place in form of a seminar. So we were researching together with students from bachelor and master's degrees from different disciplines. And it was really special because students could voluntarily choose to take part in the seminar. So in the end, we ended up being an entirely queer seminar with only queer positionalities. So we had trans and we had cis positionalities, and we're all white, but it was a very empowering moment also for our own academic pathways, I think, to be researching in this group of only queer individuals. And I think also to make a link to what you said just in the introduction now is the importance of moving from being an object to being a subject. So I think this connects very well to the format of our research also. So when we are going through the results, what we found out, we mostly want to highlight the links that we found with what we found out with what we were reading in the book. So I think like what we got from the online forums is that youth were talking about experiencing gender euphoria as very important for forming their identities. So it was a very constitutive experience of being who they were. I think in a way those forums then also served as spaces to articulate who you are, and also at the same time engaging in community, to be engaging in a dialogue. So you have those two sides of like realizing who you are, articulating who you are, and also understanding yourself as part of a community, which resonated very much with this concept of the critical self-recognition that you also bring up in the book. So I think in a way just this like experience of gender euphoria that the youth are talking about and also engaging about it in the forums could almost be seen maybe as a precedent of a social movement also in that way. A second point is that I thought it was so interesting how much you centralize knowledge and speech and education as being parts of the social movements in general, because I think that very well connects to how we saw the forums as being spaces where people could enable their own authority over knowledge. And that was so important for them. Also, especially because it were spaces that were outside of the dominant discourse. It was kind of protected spaces where they could form an own dialogue, and by this challenging also the cis-central discourse. Yeah, maybe so far, and you continue?
Thank you. Yes, one thing that connects to the global fascisms you just talked about, it was really nice to see that the adolescents in the forums were really hopeful for the future. And I mean, of course, we selected the texts and we didn't analyze everything. We specifically analyzed posts and comments that included accounts of gender euphoria, but even adolescents who lived in non-supportive environments, non-supportive families, were looking forward to the future when they could live as their authentic and true selves. And I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. Yeah, I think that's of course only on an individual level, but what you just said and what you also said in the book, that it's important even in the face of global fascisms and yeah, to still create utopias and think what a world could be like that we want to live in. And lastly, a lot of the triggers of gender euphoria that the adolescents talked about were related to their bodies, like what clothing they wear, how they wear their hair, or using hormones as gender affirming procedures. And I came across the term of embodiment, and this this could lead to a sense of embodiment, modifying the body in ways so it's authentic, and then embodiment is also what gender euphoria feels like, what it manifests as when people feel like relief. I'm sure you all know it, you feel lighter. And when people feel gender euphoria, that might be relief, or maybe joy that's in the whole body. And in the book, you also talked about the connection between knowledges and the body and embodied knowledges. And yeah, we just wanted to know what is the meaning of embodied knowledges in travesty movements.
So Marietta, I invite you to reply to that, and I invite everybody else already to collect their questions and thoughts to share, because we're gonna go, we'll open the round to the public after your reply.
Okay. First, thank you so much for sharing your research. The academia is a tricky place to navigate, but but it is also the place that I have chosen to dispute, let's say that. And okay, first I would like to highlight what you said about those spaces that allow us to articulate who we are, because I started to read and to write about trends, about transfeminism, about Afro-transfeminism on the internet, online, in forums. And transfeminism itself was introduced in Brazil through those online forums. So after was through those online forums that most of us that nowadays are within universities, pursuing our master's degrees and PhDs. Our beginning in terms of our first encounter with transfeminism was in those online forums. So even the manifesto, right? The manifest was written and posted in Facebook in a moment that Facebook was a very relevant social media in Brazil, and where in a moment where Facebook was like the main tool to disseminate like feminist knowledge produced by a younger generation of feminists. So those online spaces, they were very important to me, even in terms of health, because when I started my transition, we didn't have a lot of doctors in Brazil who knew how to handle our bodies. And there was a community in Orkut. I don't know if German people know Orkut, but it was a very relevant like social media in Brazil back then. And we had like a group called Hormones for Transgender People. And there was a topic within this community where we learned how to understand our blood exam and things like that. So we became our own doctors through those communities with the knowledge that was being produced and disseminated through those online communities. So your research resonates a lot in this sense. And regarding embodied knowledge, we were talking about that. So one of the challenges in my experience when I started to pursue my undergrad in pedagogy was to challenge this idea that I would need to hidden my body, my subjectivity, my identity when producing theory. And I came with I decided to not reproduce this kind of assumption, and I decided to actually challenge this assumption because black feminists, they were teaching me a different path, you know. They were saying that the knowledge that comes from this experience of someone who understands the margins and the center is powerful, you know, and bringing this experience into the knowledge production is something that we must value. So, in the case of the knowledge production led by travesti scholars, I do feel that we recognize the how valuable it is to produce this knowledge, recognizing where this knowledge is coming from. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our time has